Hi, everyone. I think we'll start now, and a little bit of housekeeping first. We will have a little discussion on stage, and we will have questions at the end. So please note down your questions so that you have really a nice array of speakers to please pose them. And we hear there's also online. So if there's any online questions, please do let us know. We can try and take some for the speakers as well. So before we start, I know lunchtime is not the greatest. Time to have after lunch is not the greatest. Can I have a show of hands of how many of you in the room are actually working on responding to climate crisis, be it drought, flood, cyclones, whatever it is? A show of hands. No? None? Yes? Oh, that's quite a few. Okay, good to know. And then how many of you have heard, and this is my pitch, I'll talk about it later, but how many of you have heard about the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations? Okay, we've got a few. Oh, not bad, not bad. Thank you. And then how many of you have signed the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations? Ooh, now we've got a few people that we need to get signed up on it. Anyway, so thank you for joining us, and bear with me for a bit of self-promotion for the Climate and Environment Charter. But just to introduce myself, my name is Nishanie Jayamaha. I am the co-coordinator for the Secretariat of the Climate and Environment Charter. Why are we here today? We're here today to talk about an important topic that we've been hearing in the previous sessions about climate change and Climate-Nexus, Climate-Water-Nexus. This particular session is an interesting one because we want to frame it in a way that we actually bring about an understanding in the humanitarian sector about the importance of climate change. I think all of you know it because you are responding to it. But the humanitarian sector hasn't been very up to speed of climate action in the humanitarian sector until quite recently. And this is where the Charter actually brings a good framework in the humanitarian sector because it was not there before. So the IFRC actually started looking at why is climate action and climate change and environment sustainability important for humanitarian action. And the Charter brings this really principles. We talked about humanitarian principles as part of also the next set of principles that we need to look at concretely when we're looking at supporting communities who are vulnerable and in need on the ground, who are impacted by climate change and climate crisis increasingly. And we as humanitarians are responding to these crises on top of conflict, on top of protracted crisis, on top of multiple complex emergencies that we are having to deal with, and we see multiple displacements. So the Charter first two commitments are really the backbone of the commitments of how do we respond and support action on climate and environment. So the first commitment looks at how are we as humanitarian organizations adapting, being resilient, and building resilience and adaptive capacities of communities to the increasing climate impacts that they're facing. That's one, but also looking at how as we as humanitarian organizations are adapting our work, how are we changing our ways of working? Are we doing it? Are we not doing it well? How can we do it better? And then the second commitment looks at the environment sustainability of our work. And that does not mean just the carbon calculations and our humanitarian footprint, the carbon footprint or the greenhouse gas emissions. It's more than that. It's looking at, are we sustainable in our practices, such as water management, and today's topic is Climate-Water-Nexus. Are we, having better water management practices? Water is a finite resource. 3%, it's only 3% of the global world's water is actually fresh water, and of it only 1.2% is drinkable water. So really, we're talking about a finite resource. We're going to Mars now to look at if there's water or not. So we need to really look at how we're sustainable in our practices so that we're not depleting already limited natural resources. So this is part of also adaptation. How are we doing better waste management, better practices? Are we looking at nature-based solutions in our work? So that's the two basic the what of climate and environment are we looking at as humanitarian action. And then when we go down to how are we doing this? How are we actually going to implement such work? And here is why we're here to discuss a little bit more of the how we're working on the ground in practice to improve the way we work. We've got from local action, and that's the third commitment of the Charter, is how are we supporting local action and how are we looking at indigenous knowledge, local indigenous knowledge. And we've got Mercy Kieni from Oxfam, Kenya. She is a public health engineer and a WASH expert, and she will be sharing us a lot of lessons learned on how at the local level on the ground, WASH experts and people are adapting their ways of working to a finite resource that we're actually having to manage. So that's how is that happening on the ground. The other thing we as humanitarians are not great at doing is looking at evidence base, right? So, we're talking about climate science now, we're hearing a lot of the IPCC reports coming in, but how are we taking this evidence, climate and environment risks, into our own programming and our planning, our designing? And we have today Karen Lebek from the University of Potsdam, who is a geoecologist and has done quite a lot of work in looking at water insecurity in rural South Africa in KwaZulu-Natal. She will have more that she will share with you on her experience. So really taking into account evidence-based research into the work we are doing as humanitarian actors. And then we have Paul Knox-Clarke, who will be sharing a little bit of the work he's been doing with the fifth commitment that we talk about in the Climate-Water-Nexus, which have the collective and collaborative action. How do we work across not just the humanitarian sector, but bringing in think tanks, academia, outside the typical humanitarian bubble that we live in, working across climate, environment, development, nexus, that we keep talking about, the nexus everywhere. And we've heard this quite a few times. How do we operate in a nexus where we are not able to do everything on our own? So how can we do better by collaborating across other sectors? So to kickstart, maybe we can go to our first question from actually Karen. Can you maybe, I'm not a water expert, so please, I'm not a climate expert either for that matter, I'm a humanitarian, but would you be able to let us know a little bit about what you mean by water security or insecurity? And can you also unpack that a bit, but at the same time, let us know how is climate change exacerbating water insecurity with communities on the ground who are the most vulnerable and the most vulnerable to climate change, who are impacted by this? Over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak here on this panel today. I'm really glad that I'm here, and especially in this humanitarian context, it's really the first time that I get into touch with so many people from this field. And normally I'm only at scientific conferences, so this is all really exciting for me. And I think it's really important that we have, and that we also keep this exchange going between science and the NGOs. So I'm happy to contribute today. And yeah, water security is a multi-dimensional framework or concept that has been used by many different actors, also governmental and non-governmental organizations, but also academic scholars from all kinds of disciplines, and they've been framing it in many different ways. So it's actually a very vague kind of concept. But there is, of course, also a humanitarian framing that is probably well known to many of you. And for example, there's a definition by Jepson and Wutig in a paper from 2017 where they say water security is the ability to access or benefit from affordable, adequate, safe and reliable water for health and well-being, and that's a kind of a humanitarian framing. And then water insecurity would be the condition where one of these 4 dimensions is significantly reduced or not attainable at all, so that this threatens well-being and health. And yeah, I think water insecurity is actually, it's not only just the opposite of water security, but it's also really useful to look at water insecurity because it's often in these development contexts, the majority of people actually is water insecure and not water secure. So so it's not only about just asking, okay, are they water secure or not? But if we look at the different dimensions of insecurity, we can actually measure them, and then for example, to evaluate or to assess whether a certain intervention or development program has succeeded in reducing water insecurity. And that's something that I also did in my PhD in South Africa, for example, and where I actually evaluated the water services from the district municipality in terms of water insecurity of households. And yeah, that's what I did. And I think so the second question was the climate change effect on water security. And so I have many examples for that. Of course, there's a wide variety of effects of climate change on water insecurity. And I think most importantly, as you also asked in the beginning, are the water-related hazards, floods and droughts, that will increase in intensity and frequency. And we can see them already today, and the effects that we see is that the floods can actually really destroy or disrupt water services, because they can cause overflowing of sewage treatment plants, for example. And But I think the most important thing to look at is actually how climate change changes water availability and temperature. And both of this has really huge implications for water security, because the water availability, of course, is quite clear that when it rains less, then there's less water, but temperature increases the demand for water. So at the same time, there's a high demand and we have less water at the same time. So that's really a challenge. And temperature can also increase the growth of pathogens, for example, and also reduce oxygen levels in water, so that people that, for example, as you said, in communities that are vulnerable, many people are still dependent on surface water, and they really need to go to rivers and streams to collect water, and then it's really important for them to have a healthy water bodies, and so temperature affects that too.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's an important point about, the availability and the demand and supply of water. And you really mentioned, Karen, the aspect of how climate change and impacts of floods, of droughts impact our water accessibility. And maybe I'd go on to Mercy to get a little bit of, if you can pass the, sorry, we have 3, Mercy. So, I mean, East Africa is one of the most highly climate-impacted, regions in the world, and you are working in really remote areas with communities who are very vulnerable to this climate change. So, what are you seeing, and what are you seeing on the ground where humanitarian actors and WASH actors are having to adapt? Because we are talking about adaptation, and WASH is one of the most I think in the humanitarian sector, what I've seen is WASH has actually been the sector that has adapted mostly and been a little bit more head in the forefront. And I think other sectors can learn, and this is one of the other points of this session, to learn from different sectors. So what are your experiences, what have you seen? And please do share with us some of the aspects of from Kenya.
Yeah, thank you very much. When you talk about adaptation, that means we have to be willing to change from the norm, which I would want to feel very confident that we are leading the curve. I don't feel so personally, despite being in the sector. I'll start by saying, first of all, it's good that you see that we in East Africa bear the biggest brunt of climate change, despite being the lowest emitters, I think, in the continent. And what we are seeing is, we say drought is not a new thing, floods is not a new thing, and these are some of the climate-induced crises that we are facing. But what is new and what is disturbing is the protracted droughts that we're facing, is the frequency of the climate-induced crisis that we are facing. And what this has gone ahead to do is, just expose the weaknesses in the systems, reduce the coping ability of the communities that we work in. And in addition to that, we're always looking at humanitarian actors to come in and, save the situation. But even as humanitarian actors, how do you, be very quick to respond in a situation that is really cyclic or really, really repetitive in that sense? I joined the humanitarian sector just a couple of years ago, and I would say in the last 3 years, as a direct implementer, like in operations, I have not had a break. In Kenya, I've had to deal with drought when I came in, the longest protracted drought we have had for the last 40 years. And when we thought we were about to take a break, we had a flood that ended up killing over 200 people in Nairobi alone. And we thought, okay, so after 3 months, we are taking a break. It was just this very, very short break, I think, of saying, okay, let us look at how we can move to recovery. Before then, we had another flood. And right now, there is focusing to show that we are moving into a drought. What this has done actually is just to frustrate the efforts that have been put in place, in terms of putting up infrastructure. And this is the other thing that I would like to talk about, how I would say climate change's impact is destroying infrastructure. And now speaking into what Dr. Karen has spoken about, availability and, being moving towards water security, really now looks like a very far off dream. For a lot of actors, not only even, let alone the community, even for the actors themselves. Because one, we do not even have enough information to look into how are we resolving the elephant in the room. You don't know what is coming next and how soon. And then the other thing that I would like to speak about is how this has affected the indigenous communities. So earlier we were talking about, just there isn't water that is available, reduced availability of water in terms of quantity, and now talking about the quality as well. How, although not very well specified and well prescribed, climate change is also affecting water quality. And then, the loss in the well-being, in the sense that earlier the communities, let me talk from the perspective of pastoralists. Earlier, how they would cope, they would just migrate from one zone to the other and look for the next place where the water is available, where pasture is available. But how does that happen if it is every 3 months, or if the drought has taken 2 years? So the change in migratory routes, then there was the whole thing of just loss in their livelihoods, which in this case is livestock. And they need to come back to the household with nothing. Literally, in the last droughts, Kenya alone lost $1.78 billion in investment in livestock only. And translate that to, how does that translate to the poor community and the poor household, the man who was to go back to the household, and now being, having the ego and esteem of the provider, and now has nothing and has to stay back and sit with the wife and children. And this led to gender-based violence, led to, conflicts. Of course, there is a resource-based conflicts that we are aware of. And what has not been spoken much about is, the well-being in terms of mental health. And now, how are we coping as humanitarian actors and in this phase of uncertainty and in a situation where we are being looked upon as the solution providers, rather? And I think the one thing that we've determined is it's not business as usual. And business as usual in this case would mean, like continuing to respond when there is a drought, when there's a flood, we continue to respond as we have been, and just realizing, no, that is no longer feasible in the first place. If you think about maintaining status quo, then we have failed as a sector in the first place, because we'll not even be able to maintain that status quo. In terms of looking at climate change, it's really been dubbed as a water crisis. Climate crisis is being dubbed as a water crisis because it is. But then how we've been looking at it previously is humanitarian actors will provide immediate aid, and the development actors will provide the long-term systemic changes, policy changes. But then one of the things we realized is that cannot really work anymore. We need to work together. We need to, just improve coordination and integration across sectors. And we're talking about localization and saying localization is not really just about looking at the local actors only. It's about looking at everybody who is involved in the sector and, just listening to each other. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and we'll come back to you on that, actually. There's a specific question on localization, and this is something we heard quite a bit. Paul, and I think I'd like to tap into you and the work you're doing with Oxfam and ELRA in a collective way. As Mercy mentioned, we as a sector, as a humanitarian sector, is not able to do this alone. We need to work better collaboratively. We need to have data, information. We're not having enough of that information gathering. So from the work you have been doing with the research work with ELRA, can you let us know what you're finding? Or what you're not finding? I don't know, you tell me.
Yes, I should say I'm very much part of a team doing this work, so I want to recognize some of you are in the room. The findings will come out in December, actually, but so this is a sort of quick sneak peek. Exactly, it's a sneak peek. The question that Elra was asking is, given the reality of the climate crisis, what do we need to know more about, and what do we need to be able to do in the WASH sector that we currently don't know or currently can't do? So it's research and innovation, essentially. And the way that we've gone about that is looking at the existing research, looking at doing a literature review of what's out there, and then, which is really largely about identifying what the problems are, and then kind of drilling down into, given those problems, with focus groups, and we've had actually 16 country focus groups, and a lot of key informants of those problems. What do we need to know, and what do we need to be able to do that we can't currently do? And no surprise, the sort of things that come out as problems are the sort of things that my colleagues have just been talking about. So, for example, a lot of problems related to the fact that climate leads to more frequent and destructive weather-related emergencies. Problems also about the less acute challenges of climate change. So about water availability, which we've touched on and we'll talk about a bit more, about quality, pollution, pathogens in water. So these kind of longer-term issues. Also, a lot of challenges that relate to the underlying vulnerability that Mercy spoke about. The people who are affected by the disasters and by the long-term access to water problems are already less healthy, less well-nourished as a result of climate change. And then finally, problems that relate to people's knowledge and awareness about the reality of climate change, and so their ability to make choices around what they do in response to that reality. So, pardon me, the kind of things that we've been, colleagues have brought up are, unsurprisingly, the kind of challenges that came out. We got 7 major buckets of problem, if you like. I won't go through them all. And under each of those, we got about 10 to 15 specific problems. And I definitely won't go through all of those. But so we're coming up with kind of, around about 100 plus specific areas that could be focus of research and innovation. If we look across the whole piece, what's kind of bubbling up for now, and as I say, we haven't written up the results, but the kind of things that are bubbling up are, firstly, some of these challenges are very new. or at least they're very new to humanitarians. So the issue of heat waves, for example, is something that humanitarians are only really starting to engage with, although the mortality related to heat waves is very high. Yeah? Cities running out of water is another thing. This has not been part of really our historical discourse. It has happened in the past, but it's not been something that humanitarians have really dealt with since the Second World War, but it's now a potential reality. So some of these things are very new. Many of them, what climate change is doing is it's taking existing challenges around availability or quality or sanitation. How do you do sanitation in situations where there is limited water? What do you do about vector control and water? What do you do? Lots of things which are water storage. And it's making those existing challenges much, much more acute for far more people. So you've got these new things, but you've also got, if you like, the cast list of old horrors, which are now more prevalent and more difficult in many ways. The second thing that we're seeing is it's not just climate, It's a mistake to take climate out of the bigger picture. And I know, we have to cut things up and sectoralize them, but what climate is, some of the things are climate unique, but many of them, it's the related impacts of climate, displacement, conflict, and in the wash sector, often poor water management that add up together to create these vulnerabilities. The third thing, which I think comes up quite often when you're looking at innovation areas and research areas, is it's not just the tech, yeah? It's not just the widgets, as we say in English, the technological fixes. While some of the problems are the sort of things where it is actually a technological challenge that needs to be addressed, it won't surprise you that many of them are actually about processes. Many of them are social problems where the technology is embedded in a human process. And that, in a way, is harder to fix because you can't kind of Elon Musk your way out of it, So these are things like fecal waste management. It's a perennial problem, but actually the processes of moving and ensuring that is done. The overall management of water in such a way that marginalized and vulnerable people are able to access that water. The process whereby WASH and public health actors at various different national levels engage around vector control, diagnosis and response. These kind of processes, inter-organizational processes, a lot of the problems are those, and so they're not really just about technology. Other findings, finally, when we looked at the research that's there's a lot of research on the impacts of climate change on people's vulnerability. There is very, very, very little research on what you do about it. So there's very little evaluation of adaptation and approaches that people have taken to try and resolve these things. So if you're in the research business, I would definitely be looking at that area. And yet, when we ask people what they want more. They want to know specifically for that county or that province of that country what the impacts of climate change will be there. So that's very difficult because how do you set up a mechanism that will do that in all of the places where humanitarians are operating? Finally, I think one of the things that we found which is really important is there is a huge disconnect between what is already known, before you get onto the new research, what is already known and what our colleagues working on the ground actually know. They are so busy doing all of the other things that they have to do that the area of climate change, and they don't have time to access sort of 30 documents about sort of that's there in an academic. So there's a piece also about getting information to people on the ground so that they can come up with responses. So those are some of the overview points that we're finding.
Wow. Quite a lot of commonalities from what you're saying, Paul, to what Mercy said, to what Karen said. I mean, I think one of the key things we've heard over and over again is we don't have time, to be looking at, because Mercy mentioned we're so busy, we don't even have time to breathe, to even think, plan, be more proactive, look at long-term planning, preparedness. And at the same time, we don't have lessons learned. And we heard this in quite a few of the past sessions about documenting decision-making and documenting what we've done. And sometimes we don't like to talk about bad practice, and sometimes that's also important to really learn from bad practice, because otherwise we end up making the same mistakes. So I think maybe, Karen, to you, coming from, and we heard a little bit about Paul, what might be the research questions next, or for researchers out there, what do you suggest to us as humanitarian actors working on a topic that's broader than the humanitarian sector aspects? On water security, what should we do to change? Or what are some of your suggestions for us coming from a research, a knowledge data perspective? What can we do better? Or what are your advice to us, or thoughts about it even?
Okay, thanks. Maybe to link what Pao said, actually, wait, I just have to collect my thoughts. I think, there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change. I think that is something that really sometimes could paralyze people, or maybe also overwhelm people, and they actually don't want to deal with it, because they don't want to think too much ahead, and they're like dealing with their everyday problems, and they already have so much to do with that there actually is just no space left for thinking about climate change. But maybe one thing that that can help to get around this barrier is actually that the things that are happening now in water management, because there's so much, there's so many problems already that are, as Paul said, that it's not only climate change. There's so many other things that are really problematic, and there's so many other things that are not well functioning, that it's also really good to just focus on these things, because by that we can already build resilience to future climate change. And also I want to add that climate change is already going on now. So the things that are happening now, we can already learn from them. So if there's an event happening, and the way we react to it, and the things that went wrong, we can learn from that for now and for the future too, because it will probably just get worse, but there's already so many things happening that we can learn from. And there's also, apart from climate change, there's also a huge climate variability. So as Mercy said, there's always been floods and droughts. It's not new. So we can already learn from how people have been dealing with floods and droughts in the past, and try to apply that to the future. And as I said, you really build resilience by getting the water management in order, and getting water services to work is already a huge step. And what is also really important, I think, is to look at divergent water securities. That's something that I found in my research. Of course, that water security of some people can come at the cost of water security of other people, that there's a lot of inequality. That's a point that probably most of you are aware of already. But I think that's something that we don't think of a lot, is if we think of these divergent water securities when it comes to future generations. So the water security of us today, if we try to increase it and enhance it, can also come at the cost of the water security of future generations. So we also have to take that into account. We have to really be careful not to reduce their water security by enhancing our water security. For example, if we exploit groundwater resources, we really need to pay attention to sustainable groundwater management. That's a really important thing that I think it's one of the key advice that I want to give you today, because I think that's really overlooked a lot. And I know that groundwater is a huge topic in humanitarian help. And and I think, do I have some time, or is there, no? Okay, can come back.
No, thanks. I think that's really important. And this is where we, as humanitarians, are not excellent at long-term planning, long-term thinking, looking at water management in a more holistic approach. And that's because most likely we don't have the expertise, or we don't have that wherewithal or the time to do it. And I want to go back to you, Mercy. You ended your topic about local action, local actors. And, what is role of local actors, and we talked about localization a lot in this Congress, right? But what do you see the role of and the diversity of actors on the ground that's important and crucial to ensure that we as a sector is moving forward, working collectively, and is there something that we need to be really rethinking better or thinking differently? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, of course, different people have different understanding of who local actors are. To some, it's the communities, the end users. To some, it's the local government at the subnational level. But basically, I think when we talk about, for me, where I'm coming from, local actors is everybody who is engaged within the locality that we are targeting. And from this sense, I'm not only talking about the end users, I'm also talking about the national NGOs, the government themselves, the private sector, the researchers and innovators that are working within that area. That a lot of times we tend not to integrate with or work with and end up reinventing the wheel. And in this case, I think for me, when I look at it, the role of local actors is being lead agents. One of the feminist principles that we talk about is nothing for us without us. And talking about things that are happening within our locality, being the lead agent in that, because I want that change probably more than any other external person would want it. And so there is that being, just being at the center of it all. At Oxfam, we've been leading on the localization agenda and just, like in the humanitarian sector, really being at the front line and taking huge risks, to just ensure that the humanitarian local leadership is empowered and has better capacity to even respond to crisis. And in that, what we have seen is, just gaining access. So the local actors have opened up the doors to us in ways that we could not have expected, to the community and to areas that would not have been accessible. And in that, just for them being able to provide for us localized understanding of the context. There is what we would provide as, from the global perspective or as an international organization, but then there is the local understanding that we would not have gotten were it not for for really working with the local actors. And then the last thing is, just for them to provide localized solutions. They are the first and last responders. When there is crisis, they already have some solutions to provide and they do it. And then finally, when I'm talking, for example, one of the projects that we're doing at Oxfam in Kenya is looking at how we can improve operation and maintenance of rural water projects in a sustainable way, especially in times of crisis. And this time, we're not only talking about maybe flood or drought, we're just talking about climate change in general, and the local actors being present. And in this project, we're working with the private sector who are local. They understand the markets better than any NGO would understand. And so they're able to quickly look at what technological solutions are suited for those rural communities. And then looking at how are we working as international organization with these rural actors. And the one thing that's, we're looking at localization as not just being, not looking at them as implementers, but you're looking at an environment where there can be co-production. We can leverage on what the community has, but also we can bring the global expertise and experience into that local context and come up with a solution that is most feasible for that community. And the other thing, of course, that is a bit obvious is funding, which is probably the biggest contribution that we bring to the table. We're as international organization, there is places we can access, and you have the trusts of probably funding mechanisms that the local organization or actors do not have. So bringing that to the table. And if I can, maybe you can allow me to mention some of the biggest challenges that we've had in this is, there is no trust. You could have, as one organization, you could have trust to your local actors, but globally, we have been talking about localization, but really, how much trust do we have for our local actors, to entrust them with the funding, and then also to entrust them with the same funding terms that we have from our donors, and entrust them with the same. Most of the times we tend then to be more rigid with our local actors, of course, because we are accountable to the donors. But I think one of the biggest lessons that we have learned is being more flexible to allow learning from the failures, which also you mentioned about really. One of the reasons we are doing business as usual is the fear of failure and fear to do things differently. But then how do we move forward if you're not putting ourselves in a vulnerable state where we can fail and learn from it and fail forward? Finally, I think I would like to talk about building the capacity of local actors, just being aware that the capacity cannot be global capacity, but we have that knowledge. And I think one of the biggest things that we are talking about is there is information somewhere, there is innovation, technology somewhere that could solve a problem, which probably is accessible to us as global actors, but when you come to the local level, is not. I don't know if it's probably accessible, but they are not aware where it is, which is important to what Paul was talking about. Thanks.
Thank you. I think you raised quite a few crucial points. Trust. I mean, we talked about localization across the board during these sessions. I've been in most sessions, and every session had a topic about localization. And it's interesting that we still, after so many years of the World Humanitarian Summit, localization, grand bargain, and we talk about local action on the ground and the lack of trust. And this is interesting about funding. We'll come back to that topic. I'd like to quickly maybe open up the floor if there are any questions from the audience. I hope so. No questions? Maybe until you think about one. We did have a question that was a little bit on the funding piece, actually. We've heard during the whole of this Congress about the limited funding resources, the cutting of funding by, for example, the German humanitarian funding, and across the board you see this in all other governments where it's becoming harder. And we also see in the humanitarian program cycles, the humanitarian response plans, that it's becoming really niche, like what is the need? What's the humanitarian assistance piece? And we can only put that in your humanitarian response plans in many of the countries. So we're hearing two things. One is a limited funding anyway for humanitarian programs. Then also in programs, when we are putting it into humanitarian program cycles and the humanitarian response plans at country level, that they're also saying we can only look at humanitarian assistance and very limited to providing assistance. We are today unpacking Climate-Water-Nexus. We're talking about a lot of these things are long-term issues and challenges. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about looking at water management, environment sustainability. We're talking about, how we looking at innovation, the problem of not having to fail. If you fail, that's also considered, we might not get funding. So we're having these issues, and I think I'd like to maybe ask a round of questions, and I'm not sure who wants to take that up between the three of you, all of you. Is this something that then humanitarians should be focusing on? Climate change or long-term water management, is this our remit? Do we have the funding for it? Do we have the space for it? Not sure who wants to start. Maybe Paul?
Yeah, I think...
Don't forget.
It's maybe the fundamental question, because the needs are greater than the resources, and of course climate change and other factors will make that more and more true as time goes by. I mean, climate change is killing people, and it's going to kill a lot more people, just like that. You know, on a heat wave day, the estimates, the best estimates are that between the excess mortality in an area struck by a heat wave increases by between 12 and 20%. So that's thousands of people in a city. There are things called GLOFs. I don't know if you've come across GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods, which up to now have been fairly limited. But in some countries, you have population settlements of up to 300,000 people, which are directly downstream from these lakes that can just burst overnight. So I think there is a good working case to make that climate change is a danger to mortality, morbidity, and dignity, which is the business that we're in. I think beyond that, though, beyond, if you like, the sort of headline-grabbing climate disasters, we need to go to these other issues that we've been discussing about the long-term impact on mortality as it goes on within a protracted crisis from waterborne diseases for kids, which are already a huge killer. Yeah? I heard about, maybe apocryphal, but I heard about a situation where displaced people were being asked, you know, are you a climate displaced person or are you a conflict displaced person? Yeah, and it doesn't work like that. Obviously, you know, climate change for these very large numbers of people is one of several factors which is leading to misery. Which means, I think, one, we've got to be really careful that we're not doing lots and lots of climate change programming. We're doing humanitarian programming. But the humanitarian programming and the humanitarian euro needs to be aware of what is driving that misery, that death, that lack of dignity, so that it can be, so it can respond to the particularities of that form of danger, in the same way as we do with conflict. So I think the problem comes when it starts being an either-or. You know, when it starts being, oh, you know, are you a conflict humanitarian? You're a climate humanitarian.
Mercy, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, okay, a lot of times climate change is looked upon as, you know, like in terms of providing solution as a developmental issue. And then a lot of the times the development world looks at it as an advocacy issue. And somewhere the solutions get lost along the way. You know, the actual actionable solutions gets lost. And I think that's why for me, you know, like I would call for breaking of that silo in terms of looking at climate change as either development or climate or humanitarian. The reason we always say in Kenya, the reason the humanitarian department is very, very busy and not taking a break is because someone in the development sector failed somewhere. Somewhere in the world, someone in the globe has failed to do their job. And if we continue to all sit back and say it's development, it's humanitarian, then the solutions get lost and we don't attain them. When we're talking about, you know, water security and, you know, having really the safe, affordable, inadequate quantities and quality for the local community, then we cannot peg that as, you know, just either humanitarian or, you know, development, or talk about climate change as an a bit. For me, it always sounds like we're talking at climate change as just a phenomenon that we don't want to put a pin to it, whereas it's a real monster that we need to look into. So in terms of do we need to invest, to continue investing, there's a reason as to why climate change, or the climate crisis has been dubbed the water crisis, because it really is. If we don't have water, then it doesn't matter which department or which sector you are coming from. You're going to face the consequences.
Thank you. Kevin.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with what Mercy said and Paul. And I think that climate change really is water is actually at the heart of climate adaptation. It's really the key to climate adaptation is really to focus on water and water security, because climate impacts on humans are mediated by water in any case. So we feel the impacts through water-related hazards, or through less water availability, or through reduced water quality. And so adaptation should really focus on water and water management and enhancing water security, I think. And I think that's really important for also integrating that into humanitarian action. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. And I see 2 hands up. Who has the microphone? One here right in front of the room, and one at the middle of the room. You have a mic? Oh, you're getting one. Please introduce yourself and ask the question. Is it very specifically for one? Or thank you.
Yes, thank you to the four of you. My name is Andrea, and I am really amazed with all your presentation and the points that you made. And I think what combines what I've heard from all of you is that there is enough evidence, and there's a consciousness about the gravity of the situation, but we don't only have overstretched systems, but we have overstretched individuals that cannot even take a breath in between disasters. So I guess my question would be to maybe get a little bit deeper into this, and maybe it's at first hand directed at Paul. If there's any, are there any solutions or ideas that emanating from your research as to what are short-term solutions for that? Like how, I mean, the theory is clear, but how do we actually do it? And without maybe grappling with, changing whole organizational cultures and changing the system as such, but, little by little examples of, if we do that, then another thing might be easier to do. That would be very interesting, but also from the rest of you, if you have any ideas about that.
Thanks, and we'll take the other question as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Imad Kudmani, and I'm a student of Peace and Conflict Studies. And I used to work actually as a WASH and rehabilitation officer for Action Against Hunger, and also worked before for many organizations. So I have actually one question about advocacy and on the local level and on the international level. I would like to know, what are the, let's say, the channels, the mechanisms that could be used to push forward for this realization of the nexus between climate and WASH response. On the local level, maybe I would hear from Mercy about that. It would be nice. And also on the international level, when it comes to the donors. And here also I have a question, could also a follow-up question related to the politics itself, because we know that funding eventually is related to the changes of, political parties in some states. Unfortunately, the climate is still a debated topic for many. I would give an example, the USA, for example, and that, of course, will affect the funding of a humanitarian response, especially when it comes to climate. So I would really like to hear your opinion about that. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll take another one more question and then come back, maybe. Yep. So one question there. We'll come back to you. We'll do another round.
Thanks so much. My name is Kira. I'm working for Action Against Hunger here in Germany. I'm leading our advocacy work, and we heard a lot about evidence-based advocacy. I'm very glad to hear that. We also commissioned with ODI research on another nexus, hunger, climate, conflict nexus, and a lot of things you touched upon, we've also discussed internally a lot. And my question is a bit, when we have limited resources and more also climate-driven needs, should we become also on this issue more political? This was also yesterday and today in a lot of sessions here discussed. Should we do more advocacy? Should we be more outspoken? And we also internally discuss whether it is our role to play a bigger role in the COP. We are at COP as Action Against Hunger, as a lot of other NGOs are from the humanitarian sphere, but we are definitely not the majority in this fora. And I think in a way it's good that we are there, but I also wonder what's our impact. And my question basically is, if we have to look more into the root causes, as you also rightfully pointed out, should we be better presented at COP from a humanitarian lens, or when we look into complementarity and stretched resources, what we've also heard also by our own staff, etc., focus more on collaboration, maybe with better placed actors that are already in the space, they are already established and connected, that they apply a humanitarian lens, and we are rather informing them for evidence-based advocacy on behalf of the humanitarian needs by climate crisis. Thank you.
Thanks. Can we start with you, Paul, Mercy, Karen? Which one do you want to start with? Shall we start with the one any solutions and ideas for short term, and I might say even long term, but...
Yeah, no, those are great questions. There's so much there. This is a whole seminar, I think, which I would love to attend. The immediate thing is a great question. So I think the real challenge is that we don't overlook what's right in front of our noses by looking at the aspirational and the long term and what's in front of our noses, first of all, is quality. In WASH and across the humanitarian area, we've got to be driving, it's very simple, but we've got to be driving for better quality programming and more efficiency in the programming. Yeah? So that's an easy one, I think. I think it's a point you made already, Karen, that, that start with what you've got, because not all of the programming is as good as it should be. I think we're all aware of that. And the second thing is what I think some people call climate proofing. Before we do climate-related programming, an awful lot of existing humanitarian programs, which don't relate to climate at all, are at quite high levels of vulnerability. Look at the number of displaced camps that flood on an annual basis, for example. So actually looking at the pre-existing work we've got and just asking a little bit about what are the risks inherent in that, We were hearing earlier on from a colleague about how easy it is to close boreholes against flooding. It's not expensive, and you often have the flooding early warning. It's a small technological fix. So I think those kind of identifying exactly the question that you're asking and identifying the answers, it would be a very good start. I think it would also be a good start because maybe the 2% additional that you would require, the 5% additional you'd require on the budget for those simple climate-proofing activities would show their value to donors. It's very hard to get additional money on the donor funding to climate-proof because it's not immediate. Yeah, it's kind of you're entering resilience, and that's a different budget dealt with by a different department. But actually, when you show the difference it makes in terms of disease morbidity, for example, you've got a really good answer. You've got a really good argument to make there. So I think there are things, and I think it's really good that you ask us to focus on what they are, because those are things that most organisations could be doing by the end of this week.
Thanks. Karen, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would also like to add something to this, what Mercy called contextualized solutions. That's actually something that I also looked at in my PhD in South Africa. And I found actually by coincidence while I was doing my household survey, I found that people actually had different ways of harvesting rainwater. And I think, diversification of water sources is also a huge thing in adapting to climate change. So rainwater is also important to collect rainwater when it rains, and then you have some storage for the dry season or for days when it doesn't rain. So in South Africa, the statistics say that actually only, I think, less than 5% of rural households harvest rainwater. So I was actually quite surprised that in the rural areas where I went, most of the households harvested rainwater. but just not in a conventional way. They just harvested it in their own makeshift way. And I think it's important to look at the ways that the solutions that people have already come up with, and to try to integrate those into humanitarian interventions, because they actually couldn't harvest them in conventional ways. This is just very simple, but because it has to do with their kind of buildings, the structure of the buildings that they lived in. They were not like straight concrete houses where you can attach a gutter that you buy in a shop and a large rainwater harvesting tank. So because most of the people actually lived in round huts, so they couldn't attach these straight gutters. So what they did is they made their own little gutters, so like by attaching little pieces of corrugated iron next to each other, and then they collected much smaller volumes of rainwater in small containers, or like drums of 210 liters. But that's actually also beneficial. I mean, you would think that, yes, it's the more rainwater you can collect, the better. But actually, there you can really control the quality of the rainwater. If it's a much smaller container that you can empty much faster. And then what was also important is that they took it inside during the night, because they didn't want it to get polluted during the night. And then they would really use it for drinking and personal hygiene. And there was also a rule that if the container was outside and it rained during the night, then they wouldn't use that water for drinking. They would only use it for irrigating, for example. So these are like really local, contextualized solutions that people have come up with themselves that we can just learn from. Yeah.
I'll try to address the question on advocacy and localization. I'll start by giving a small example of some of the bits of the work that we are doing. I was telling earlier this story of how when I went to Turkana and women were telling me about how their water, the taste of their water has changed, and they can no longer drink it because it's too salty. And direct translation, they'll say it's no longer sweet. And then from then, we designed a whole program on determining, so what has changed over the drought period? What changed this water? Does it have anything to do with climate change? And can we map that? Are we able to map the impact of water quality on, the impact of climate change on water quality? And from there, we are, like gathering evidence to be able to see and demonstrate that if this has a relationship, if like temperature variations or precipitation have a connection with the quality of water, this is something that we need to be looking into as a sector, and it's something that we need to be advocating for, so that government can better prepare, in terms of anticipatory actions, and even as humanitarian actors, like if you're seeking compensation for losses and damage as a result of climate change, water quality is one of the things that we need to look into. And so I'm looking at the whole journey of where it started from listening and, improving communication channels, where it's not one way. It's just not top down, engineer from Oxfam has come to give us solutions. It's more of listening from the ground, what problem is, what is happening, and from then now being adaptive and being reactive to provide the solution, to better prescribe the solution. I think doctors would say a problem that is better prescribed or is well prescribed then has a better chance of is better diagnosed, has a better chance of, like finding cure. So, and I think it's the same for us. Better, at times, even in research and in research, it's also about looking into how can we better diagnose the problem. We know climate change is an issue, but how can we better diagnose the problem at hand, so we're able now to look back at the source, at the cause, what really could have happened. And when it comes to integrated water resource management, how can we also now capture, how can we better mitigate to not first have the problem, and then how can we better adapt to resolve the problems that you're already having. And I think in this whole journey, speaking to how we can, better as a sector work with local agents of change to advocate for solutions within the climate change and humanitarian nexus.
Thanks. And, sorry? Yes, of course. You want to? Go ahead.
Sorry, just to I don't know if we're going to go on to it, but there are questions about politics.
Exactly.
Why don't we go on to it?
No, you go
Okay,
ahead. That's
sorry.
what I was about to ask you.
The starting at the end of the point around, should we be collaborating more with other actors? I mean, an emphatic yes, yes, yes. There is a, I think we've said before, it's time for a Galilean revolution or Copernican revolution. I can never remember quite who it was. Someone will tell me, where we realise that the international system does not actually orbit around humanitarians. That we're actually quite a small little planet out right at the edge of that system. And it's not all about us. And that's really, really hard. It's really hard. It's hard. But it is, and the trouble is that there's, in going to your point about the sort of political engagement, I think one of the things that it would be good to recognise is the difference between humanitarian and climate funding. That humanitarian funding is discretionary. And so governments give it because they want to, because they think it's a good thing to do. Whereas climate funding is not discretionary. It is embedded in treaty. Yeah? And so it's an obligatory funding, or should be an obligatory funding. And the more that humanitarians push for money to go through the humanitarian funding stream, the more we're actually supporting that logic of, we will give you money because we think you deserve it, rather than we will give you money because it is our duty to do so. And so the engagement of humanitarians on humanitarian terms in these climate discussions can be actually very destructive to I think, the bigger response. And which is not to say that humanitarians should not be there, but I think before turning up at COPs, it would be better, and I think the IASC, for example, is doing a much better job now than they did previously, and the Charter, I think, is also part of this. I think we're seeing this. But it's good not to turn up and be evidently competing with each other for funding. I don't think that's a good look. And that is probably getting better, but it's still an issue. And so starting by working, humanitarian organisations working together around the advocacy, but also actually taking a back seat, as I think you were suggesting, and bringing the very particular, as Mercy was saying, the very particular things that we are very particularly good at to a table, to a menu where a lot of things are required.
Mercy, do you have anything to add, or you come back to something? I have maybe on the advocacy piece at global level, I think there's a few things that we've been doing as a collective, as humanitarian actors, and I keep saying this, we need to speak with one voice, and this is where collective advocacy, collective messaging is really key, be it at COP or be it with donors, etc. So there's a few things on it, is what Mercy mentioned before, ensuring that we are actually able to fail to learn better, because this sort of programming that we're doing is sometimes a few things that we need to really do, figure it out, shit, it didn't work. Now we need to do better. And how do we document that, look at that sort of evidence-based, because I hear all the ways the donors keep saying, oh, we need evidence-based. So we'll give them evidence. Why can't we do that? That is doable. We are doing the work on the ground. We can actually make sure we're collecting that data and providing that data in a very, a tangible manner to those who are decision makers, right? And that is something onus on us to be able to do that, to actually advance advocacy. So one is that. And the flexibility piece is really key. We keep hammering on this flexible quality funding, especially with the increasing needs and humanitarians being asked to respond in places where there's multiple crises. And as you said, Paul, rightly, I'm not counting if you are a climate displaced because of climate change or if you're displaced because of conflict. It's happening multiple ways. And if your pot of money is only for conflict displaced and this pot of money is only for this, we're not going to be able to deliver effectively. And that's something we heard today and yesterday a lot. We are being asked by donors, we're being asked by actors to be effective. Effective humanitarian action can only happen if we are able to respond effectively, have that flexibility to do it. We heard that in so many panels. We are understanding better the needs of communities. We work with communities closer, so we're really analyzing how can we deliver more efficiently on the ground, noting these are long-term issues, but we are also responding to emergency. So that is another thing. And this sort of work you're doing with, the climate conflict analysis, the climate water analysis, these are all important data that we're bringing forward to support a case better, be it at COP, be it with climate actors, be it with others. And going back to Mercy, the climate justice piece, the loss and damage work, where as humanitarians are terrible at talking about climate justice. Okay, we don't like to talk the rights piece in the humanitarian work we're doing. But the humanitarian work we're doing is basics of rights, right to water, right to life, right to shelter, right to health, right? And I think we need, as a sector, to change our narrative, change our messaging the way we're going, because if we don't figure out how we work as a collective with the climate and the development actors and us together, and we're talking different language or we're not agreeing because in the end we're serving the same communities in need. Same communities who are vulnerable, the ones who are most impacted by climate change and the least contributors to this. That's our people we're working for is that. So how do we do that better? And I think that's the advocacy we need to work with. And we did a COP29 webinar as the Climate and Environment Charter. You can find it on our website. And we brought together the peace-building actors, because peace is a huge topic this year. It's a Peace Relief Recovery Day, and the peace topic is going across the whole of COP29 this year, with water security as a huge topic, food security. Obviously, water leads to food issues, health issues. We talked about pathogens and waterborne diseases, and it's circular. So definitely, advocacy is important. How do we advocate? Work with your climate counterparts, even within your own organizations. I think the big NGOs have a climate and environment lead, and a rights lead, and a development lead, and we don't talk to each other in our own organizations. How do you influence your own organizational team members to take the conversations or the humanitarian perspectives and the needs forward as well, I think is important. I'll come to you for a question. If you have anything to add, please feel free to yes, we have a question in the front here. Anyone else? Yes, I see three hands at the back.
Thank you. My name is Lisa. I'm working with Oxfam in Germany, and thank you very much for the very interesting conversation here. My question is actually around climate financing also, because I was wondering, we've been talking a lot about shrinking funding in the humanitarian sector in this conference, and now in this session we're talking about, rising needs also due to climate change, and I'm wondering how hopeful you are on the panel that funding that might come in through the finance system, through the climate system, might also help solve some of the problems that we see on the humanitarian side. I'm just wondering, because Paul, you were saying it's maybe not a wise thing to do as humanitarians to go into these climate spaces and ask for funding to come into the humanitarian system, but how then, how do you think funding that comes through the climate system will help solve some of the problems that we see? That you've mentioned, for example, Mercy, in Turkana. If we call them humanitarian needs or loss and damage, I think doesn't really matter to the people affected. Yeah, so it's not a question directed to a specific person on the panel, but would be interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks. Who has the mic? Yes, go ahead. Please introduce
Sorry about that. I just feel I need to stand up. My name is Hadija Saidi with Maternity Foundation, and I have two questions. One to Paul. What is stopping humanitarian actors from implementing the concept of Build Back Better within the climate adaptation space? Because number one, I see it as a way where you can have humanitarian actors and development actors on the same table to build back better, yeah? And then my question to Mercy is, yesterday and today, I've heard from at least the German perspective as donors that they're investing in anticipatory action as one of the ways for humanitarian action. As an implementer working in Kenya, what are the things that have worked for you or not worked for you to mobilize these resources in anticipatory action? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Thais. I work for Médecins du Monde, Belgium. I just wanted to have your opinion and your thought about the One Health approach, because as Médecins du Monde, we have some One Health projects in DRC and Niger, and the environmental partnership is always the most complicated one to find. So yeah, I just wanted to have your point of view on this aspect, on the One Health approach, because when we go to donors, we speak about this approach every time, and we see that there is more and more interest. So maybe that's an open door for more financing and funding. But yeah, and that's for everyone.
Thanks. We have one more question from here, and I thought I saw a hand up at the back there. Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Shameen Nazar, and I am a student of public health in Hamburg. But I'm from Pakistan, and I have worked there for a very quite long period, 7 years. And I also worked as a project lead for the projects, which basically cater the integration and sustainability. So in my last project, I worked on nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive, approaches, keeping in view, the sustainability and integration. So my question is for Karen and Paul, because you both are researchers and you're working in this area, because sometimes you are working everything right. You are working on sustainability, you are working on integration, everybody is on the table. My nutrition department was there, health department is there, and governance part is there is political will. And sometimes you just reflect that I have done everything, but still, there are no results. Why? And obviously, sometimes I feel like we are continuously getting these crises, because in 2020, I was implementing the project, and this COVID happened. This was unforeseen. And then again, in the same year, then floods happened. And that was the biggest disaster in Pakistan. So it affected literally 3 provinces. So, back to the question. So can we do, because we are living in technological era, so my question is, how can we incorporate technology in order to cater water insecurity, food insecurity? Because right now in Pakistan, according to the IPC 2024 report, over 2 million children are acute malnourished, and 50% are chronic malnourished. So, yeah, it really concerns me.
Thanks. Very good question on technology.
Okay. Hey, my name is Kurt Seigen from Seigen & Stein, and I would like to answer this question directly. So thank you, Paul, very much. I really thank you very much for all the points that you have raised, and I think it's going to be a remark rather than a question. So I think one of the main problems is that humanitarians always want to socialize with other humanitarians, and researchers also only want to socialize with other researchers. Now here's the thing, there are other actors on the ground as well. For example, the industry is, how can we incorporate technology? Well, we are exhibiting just 2 meters away from that door. And the second I say, people come and address me like, what organization are you from? And I'm like, oh, we are a private company. Everybody's like, oh no, we don't want to talk to you. We are not the devils. I mean, so maybe that would be a solution. Ask other actors outside your bubble as well. We're not biting.
Absolutely, the collective, collaborative action piece. Can we go to responding to some questions? Where do we want to start? Let's maybe talk about what is stopping us from building back better. Paul? And anyone else? Mercy, Paul?
The problem, the problem with answering these questions is I'm very aware that actually the people answering them have better answers than I do. However, I will give some opinions. I think there's three things that come to mind quite quickly. One is finance. As humanitarian finance gets more and more squeezed, we know it gets harder and harder to do the sort of the long disaster risk management piece with humanitarian money. So the disaster risk management, the DRR, the preparedness are increasingly hard to fund, and so is the sort of early response rehabilitation part. The money is kind of just not really there, and I think many of us will have seen that. So that's a financial problem. I think saving your presence. There are areas where there is a lack of what would we actually do. The knowledge around how to deal with these very big problems, which are also unprecedented. We don't necessarily have the technological or the social responses for all of them. And part of the problem, I agree with what was said about working with the private sector, but part of the problem with the private sector is that much of the best work around healthcare or around water and sanitation works really well in California or Berlin, but it doesn't really work very well in Yemen or Afghanistan. It's not been designed or optimized for that because the return on investment in those areas is going to be very, very limited. And so in the WASH area, there are technical problems which, if the private sector was more involved in them, and if there was more R&D, they would probably be fixed more quickly. I think the third thing is climate change is a very difficult area to, it's all difficult to work in, but I think that as well as finance and a lack of solutions in some cases, there's also the question about the societal will among communities to make the changes that are required. I think Mercy's talked about this with respect to pastoralists in the Assal areas of Kenya, for example, where people aren't aware of the realities of climate change. All of us will tend to default to doing what we did last time, rather than making the really difficult decisions about what we have to do for the future. And the communities who've suffered either from conflict or weather-related disasters are no different from the rest of us. That if people don't necessarily know the risks, they're not necessarily able to make some of the difficult changes that building back better would require. So I think those are three areas.
Mercy, do you want to respond to either Build Back Better or the anticipatory action question? Are you seeing on the ground investment on this that's making an impact, or have you been able to access some of that anticipatory action funding, for example?
Yeah. Okay, I'll just start with just echoing what Paul was talking about. In project management, you start from, design, then you implement, you monitor, and, redesign if there's need to. And that's very ideal in research. If it's a very good concept that's been researched on, and then we implement it. If, it didn't work, then we redesign it and, just gather more information and improve it. Unfortunately, we are different people. It's different people doing the doing and different people doing the researching. So, and because there's a disconnect between the researchers, the practitioners, and a lot of times, actually, the policymakers, then that becomes a problem. And I think bits of what Paul was talking about was, how do we make this research better available to the practitioners or to the policymakers and people who are involved in the sector, so that we can all move in the same direction. Otherwise, we'll keep talking about the problem and not the solution. Then the other thing I wanted to talk about is, you asked about investment in the in anticipatory action and how we have been able to access that funding. And I think it all boils down to, so when I talk in the water sector, when I talk about anticipatory action, I'm talking about, ensuring that water is available to the people when crisis hits. And for me, that is mostly is about when I think about the system and how can I strengthen the system within the water service provision to make sure that there isn't a breakdown at any time. Not only when there is crisis, but at any time, the water is consistently available. And part of it, I would say, is about, like engaging the private sector in ensuring there is sustainable operation and maintenance of projects within the rural areas, mapping the migratory routes for the pastoralists to make sure that, when there is drought and they're migrating towards that route, then in the area they go, they find water. And in that way, someone else will say that is not humanitarian. But it's sort of like looking at it holistically. And in that sense, you've been able to get some financing. And of course, bits of the resistance you've gotten is that like just receiving the label that is not humanitarian, but also looking at it, how can we better focus crisis or, issues that might come up, and then, improving the communication channels. And that is both ways. I mean, from the end users to actors, and like being able to build that trust as part of, so that also it can trigger action. Because you could have the information, but you don't trust it enough to act. So bits of what we look at it is as part of anticipatory action is improving the communication channels and improving trust to be able to trigger action. And in that sense, there is funding, but again, yes, someone will say that is not humanitarian. But in the water sector, as I said again, it's a whole cycle. If then we are not strengthening the systems properly, at the end of the day, we'll come again and claim loss and compensation for losses and damages, which again, I'll say is still part of anticipatory action. Because when I look at it in the forecasting in the future, I'm looking at it that if I don't take action today, if I don't prepare, if I don't work with the existing even governmental structures to make sure that the government who are mandated to provide water for communities, to make sure that they are incentivized. I know it is funny. We always say it's funny that we need to incentivize the government to do their job. But a lot of times we really need to, just speak for the most vulnerable and say the government needs to be incentivized enough to go to those rural, marginalized, neglected communities to be able to provide the services that the communities deserve. And in that sense, we are preventing now coming to global platforms and claiming losses for compensation for losses and damage. Thanks.
And that refers also to that point on local advocacy. What you need to do is to work with government to incentivize them to actually go to these marginalized communities as well. Karen, do you have any on research? And we had some questions about how can we, research related, etc. Any thoughts on any of the questions would?
Yeah, on the questions on the financing, I think, I mean, I'm not really so familiar with the funding structures for humanitarian organizations, but I think just some general thoughts. I mean, in climate change, I think you always have to differentiate. I think it's, all of this between mitigation and adaptation, and I think most of the funding these days is still going to mitigation and not to adaptation. So I think that is actually something that humanitarian organizations could actually advocate for, that the adaptation funding should be increased, because that's really for humanitarian cause, because the most vulnerable people are already suffering from climate change, and they already need to adapt now. It's really urgent, and it's actually the same urgency that we have for climate mitigation is also there already for climate adaptation. It's not a future problem. And I think that has to be made clear to some people that maybe don't have this in mind yet, because they think, okay, climate change is something that we only have to deal with in the future. So yeah, that's my thought on financing. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know much about technology. I'm sorry, I can't say much about that. I think, yeah, I also agree with what Paul and Mercy said, that it's really important not to only bring researchers of different disciplines to the table, but also to work in transdisciplinary ways. That's what we call it. And yeah, to bring also practitioners to the table and people that work on the ground, and to ask them what actually their local challenges are, and maybe then it's easier to find a solution instead of only asking the researchers. That would be a thought. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Paul, on climate finance.
So yeah, that's I think so. We've talked about a lot of things that aren't working. I think climate finance is potentially very positive. There are all sorts of challenges around it. I think it's positive for two reasons from a humanitarian perspective. The first is the search to look at new sources of funding, which don't come directly from taxpayers in the global north. You know, looking at, many of them would come indirectly, but looking at bunkerage, looking at taxes on flying and so on, which brings more money in rather than just moving that money around. And I think that's a necessary condition for working on many of these things. I think the second thing that's very positive and sort of happened, I think, really over the last year or so, a couple of years, is climate financing has been highly allergic to working in fragile and conflict-affected states. For the same reasons that development financing is allergic to it. You know, it's just, it's difficult and you know, you can't invest and all the rest. And that is really changing, and that's partly by excellent work by the ICRC and others. And so the Green Climate Fund has put in its first $100 million to Somalia, which is going to be a really interesting test. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, a lot of are talking about making grant rather than loan funding, fairly limited amounts in their terms, but quite large amounts in humanitarian terms, to fragile and conflict-affected states. So there is this move to put international climate finance into the sort of places that concern humanitarians the most. And I think, you know, although I was a little bit down on some of the ways that we work as humanitarians, perhaps, one thing of the many things that humanitarians are really, really good at is complaining about the money. And this gives us a great opportunity, because we have legitimate, I think, complaints to make about the way that humanitarian action is funded in fragile and conflict-affected states. And to the degree that more money is going into those through different sources now, over different pipelines, we have a very legitimate opportunity to try and not make it like humanitarian funding has been. You know, to actually influence to the degree we can the way that that funding is structured. And I think there's three things that come up a lot, and there's probably many more you can think of, but the first is the accountability of funding to the people affected. Yeah, a perennial challenge around humanitarian funding, and yet much work has been done about it. How can that work be transferred to climate funding in fragile states? The second is localization. Yeah. Let's not build a system which we then have to spend 20 years trying to unbuild so that we can get money directly to community-based organizations. And there are useful conversations going around that about how climate finance can go directly to communities. And the third is, and we've touched on it a lot, is about siloing and not having humanitarian funding. The siloing comes around a temporal framework, that it's only if it's after a disaster, and you can't do the rest of the DRM stuff because it's humanitarian money. So that's the way that's the challenge that we have. I don't think that's a problem for climate financing. I think the problem for climate financing is going to be this thing about unpicking climate from all of the other things that are going on in fragile and conflict-affected states. And there's a danger that if you can't absolutely prove that that displacement was climate-related, you won't be able to spend climate funding on it. And we know how badly that very tight earmarking of funding works. And you were pointing to it earlier on. So we've got something to say there, I think.
Thanks, Paul. And I've been given eyes that I need to wrap up the conversation. And thanks so much. We have, I think, sorry, we didn't answer the one planet question. And I think you can please do reach out to her. And one more thing, I think, on the climate financing piece is that we've been hearing a lot of nexus discussions on the ground and nexus coordination and planning on the ground. We heard the German Foreign Office talk about it. There is a lot more with the donors. The EU is looking at it. The US is looking at it. How are we doing better planning on the ground between humanitarian development, peace, and also now we're hearing also on the climate front, because we're having limited funding pots, but we need to work across the sectors, hence the collective collaborative action piece. So there's a lot happening, there's a lot of discussions. Your work that you're doing on the ground is important to be heard at these levels. So please do bring your research, like you mentioned, and many others, to this table, and talk to your own donors and influence and others at wherever you are going, wherever you are. Thanks so much for a really interesting conversation. Thank you to our speakers. Thanks to the participants. And please do connect with them outside at coffee.